Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has made it his mission to combat illegal voting. And while studies show voter fraud is incredibly rare, Paxton insists it is a rampant problem.
I'm just telling you, there's lots of voter fraud going on. We have proof of it.
There's nothing more important to our country than saving the country from fraudulent voting. What good is the filibuster if we cannot protect our country from fraudulent voting? I don't see the point of protecting it at this point.
Well, new reporting from ProPublica and the Texas Tribune finds that Paxton, the election fraud crusader, may have voted illegally. The report explains Paxton appears to have used an address where he did not live while voting in 6 elections in the past 2 years. The report explains that Paxton's estranged wife said in her divorce filing last year that her husband moved out of their Collin County home a year earlier. But Paxton still uses that address on his voter registration and voted repeatedly in Collin County. It's not 100% clear where he does live, but he's been linked to a home in neighboring Denton County. ProPublica even shared this image of the Texas Senate candidate during a podcast appearance, seated in front of a gray fireplace that matches real estate listings for the house in Denton County. 3 election lawyers told ProPublica and the Texas Tribune Paxton may have violated the same Texas laws that his office cautioned about. Meantime, Ken Paxton's campaign says, quote, Attorney General Paxton is a lawful registered Texas voter in full compliance with the law. Let's bring in Democratic strategist Mike Nellis. He was a former senior advisor to Kamala Harris and knows Texas politics. He worked on Beto O'Rourke's 2018 Senate campaign. He now is the host of the Endless Urgency podcast. Michael Feinberg is still with us. All right, Mike Nellis, what does this mean for Ken Paxton?
Well, I think it's just another example of how he's a huge scumbag and doesn't really believe in anything that he's saying, right? He's out there talking about how voter fraud is rampant. He's got all this evidence, even though he really can't prosecute anybody. He's tried to go after folks who have, made a simple error on their address, but it turns out he's the one who's committing the voter fraud. And you look at everything about this guy is he's not even campaigning in Texas right now. He's gallivanting throughout Europe with his mistress. His wife is divorcing him on biblical grounds. He's been impeached by his own party. He's been indicted by his own party. He's had his own lawyer turn on him. I mean, he's just not a good dude. And I think the theme of this week has been that the American people are sick of scumbags. Doesn't matter if they're Democrats or Republicans. So when are Republicans going to start calling for Ken Paxton to drop out?
Except this guy seems to be Teflon politically. I mean, just even the fact that he got through that primary.
Yeah.
If you were the Tallarico campaign, how do you think you actually pierce that veil?
I mean, I think you stay focused on going to all the places that Democrats don't go, which James Tallarico can do. That's the biggest number one thing. You got to drive up these margins. But everything that needed to happen for Democrats to have a chance to win in Texas has happened. They're nominating a terrible candidate. That's worth a couple of points. We nominated a good candidate in James Tallarico. That's a couple of points. And on top of that, the economy's bad. Donald Trump is deeply underwater. You go back to the Beto O'Rourke race. Ted Cruz was actually popular in the state of Texas. People liked him. People do not like Ken Paxton.
Michael Feinberg, I want to read what election lawyers told ProPublica about the law in Texas. Quote, voting in an election when the voter is ineligible is a second-degree felony under Texas law and is punishable by up to 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. But prosecutors rarely bring cases challenging individual voters' residency claims because they are hard to prove, the election lawyer said. Do you think we see this resolved in the court of law or in the court of public opinion?
I think we are more likely to see it resolved in the court of public opinion. But given how Texas voters have chosen to cast their ballots in the past and some of the people that they have sent to Washington, D.C., I'm not even sure we'll get that sort of resolution, although I think that justice and common sense do call for it. I would just add that this is not the only time that Ken Paxton has revealed himself to, shall we say, be a slightly intellectually and ethically inconsistent human being. In a lot of ways, he's not dissimilar from President Trump, except that he's much less successful and adept at it. These are two people who claim to represent traditional religiously based morality, yet have no problem cheating on their spouses. These are people who decry what they call illegal immigrants are doing to the United States voting process, but they themselves have forwarded spurious and convoluted election conspiracies that have no basis in reality. Like, at a certain point, people are going to realize that the emperor has no clothes. I think that is going to redound, as Mike said, to James Tallarico's benefit. But I don't think that Tallarico getting elected is going to result in any sort of cosmic justice for Ken Paxton's misdeeds. I think he's just hopefully going to fade into the background as a political force worth reckoning with.
Well, this was never about election integrity, and that's part of what this gives away.
No, they want to undermine our democracy. Like, fundamentally, they're still trying to convince everybody that Trump lost or Trump didn't lose in 2020, right? That we did something nefarious they haven't been able to prove. It's the same thing here. If Ken Paxton loses this race, and I believe there's a good chance that he will, he's just going to claim voter fraud, right? They're already laying the groundwork for that. It's why we have to make sure that the wave that's coming for them in November is too big to rig, and everybody stays vigilant, because these guys are going to try to steal the election if they can.
Michael Feinberg, Mike Nellis referenced this, and I think it's worth coming back to that for 10 years, Paxton, with his election integrity unit, opened at least 169 cases of alleged voter fraud that appear to have resulted in just one judgment. If you're one of the people who he brought those charges against, what's your recourse?
You really don't have much recourse. The immunity granted to prosecutors, both under state and federal law, is really immense. And that was not an issue for a very long time, or not a very long time, but for many decades in American history, that was not an issue because these positions were held by sober, responsible people who knew the limits of both their own mandate, but also had some sort of moral compass guiding them. But what we're seeing at the state and federal level is a willingness to do anything, including just outright lying and, in the Republican Party in President Trump's case, conspiring to overturn a Democratic election to the point where a grand jury indicts you for it. That is the salient fact we can never forget when discussing any of these people. They have been indicted by their peers for conspiring to overturn a United States Democratic election. If they were willing to do that with as little preparation as they had in 2020 and 2020, we really have to be on our toes for whatever they're going to try and pull now that they've had 4 years to plan. We need to be slightly pessimistic and ready to push back against what are going to be some really spurious conspiracy theories that losers are going to put forward.
Right. I mean, to your point, it is why the actual overwhelm at the polls in terms of what people themselves can control is really the only answer.
Yeah, I mean, look, the only way they can win the midterms with Donald Trump's poll numbers, I mean, YouGov has him at 35% today. It's the lowest number he's had in a long time. He's far more unpopular than Joe Biden ever was, even at his lowest. They can only win if they cheat. That's why they're doing this mid-decade gerrymandering all across the country to try to rig the House. That's why they're desperate to pass the SAVE Act right now. Like, Trump is still holding up this housing bill. He still won't sign it, won't move it forward because he wants them to pass the SAVE Act. He wants them to get rid of the filibuster, and that's not going to fly. So they're going to find every way to cheat. And I don't think they can do anything in the races where we have like a clear advantage, but where it's close in a state like Alaska or in a state like Texas where the race might come down, that's where they could really screw us.